Hello, everyone. Today's case takes us down yet another rabbit hole that ties to another case that we've covered, when a young man would disappear from British Columbia just days after Marshal Iwaasa. 29-year-old Daniel Reoch was born March 16th of 1990 to his 14-year-old mother, April Reoch, who was Squamish First Nation. Who his father is unknown, but it's said that he's from Ontario. April traveled to British Columbia to Ontario, where her father also lived, to give birth to her son, but came back to British Columbia with him afterwards. From what is known, Daniel didn't know who his father was until he was in his adult years. Now, Daniel's case actually involves two other cases, because Daniel's mother, April, would actually also meet a tragic end and involve massive media coverage. April was described as a pretty, bright teen mother of her young son, Daniel. In the early 90s, she would be featured in a documentary called Through a Blue Lens, which documented a year in the life and death on the streets of Vancouver, and was shown to school children to deter them from drug use. I watched it here on YouTube, so I'll have the link down below. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a very educational watch. When filming began, April was just 17 years old, bright-eyed and beautiful, before becoming newly addicted to heroin and cocaine. April would state that her aunt was helping her raise her son at that time, and he was being raised by his Indigenous side of the family. In the film, April was used as the before and after of drug use, an example of what drugs could do to someone. Within months, the film crew would document as she wasted away, her teeth missing, her health ravaged by her addictions, her heart failing from substance abuse. April's life was ravaged by her profound struggles with addiction, leading her down the dark paths of sex work and crime. Treatments would prove unsuccessful for her as she struggled to stay clean and reconnect with Daniel. Police officer Al Arsenault saying, quote, "I always predicted she'd end up with a toe tag. When we first met, she was a fresh-faced kid from Squamish, coming down here looking for a little excitement. I told her exactly what would happen to her. She'd dabble in the drugs, get hooked on them, and then she'd have to turn herself out as a prostitute, and she'd be in a living hell. It all came true." End quote. Tragically, on Christmas Day in 2000, when April was around 25 years old and Daniel was only 10 years old, his mother would be found murdered. Daniel was in foster care at the time and waiting for his mother to visit him for Christmas. Meanwhile, April's body was being found in a rooming house's garbage area, stuffed into a fabric bag. Her killer would later be identified as Ian Matheson Rowe. He was living with her at the time and would confess to strangling and smothering April. His motive for killing April is unclear because I've heard two different stories. In one version of events, he killed April because he caught her stealing his rent money, but then family has said that April had gotten a check and cashed it, so it may have been him trying to steal her money. In a second documentary called Tears for April, retired police officer Al Arsenault would narrate the film in honor of April's life and struggles. Due to being in the foster home, Daniel wasn't initially at his mother's funeral until his uncle Rob noticed and went to the foster home to pick him up and bring him to it. And eventually, Daniel would be adopted by his uncle Rob and his wife, being raised by them as part of the family from age 10 until he graduated high school. Rob would say that Daniel had a very normal life after he entered their home, being raised as their fourth child alongside his cousin Sonia as if he was her brother. When Daniel got a little bit older, he was actually interviewed for the Tears for April documentary, so I'll play a clip from that now of Daniel explaining his experience with his mother.
I don't really speak much about my mom or anything. I met her again when I was 5, and I actually asked her who she, I asked my auntie, "Auntie, who is this?" And I remember that my mom broke down into tears, and it was pretty sad. I kind of felt bad, and then she said, "I'm your mom," and hugged me and cried, and I guess I don't know what happened, but I didn't see her for a while. After going there every weekend for a bit, it slowed down, and I was going there every 2 weekends, and then all of a sudden it's just like, "Where's my mom?" And then out of nowhere I'd see this car in my driveway and just know it was Danny D's and run home and see my mom, and she'd have presents or whatever. Sorry for not being around. She spoiled me rotten. Seriously, spoiled me rotten. She just loved me dearly. I know that for sure. I'll never forget that. I went from there to seeing her actually cook it all up, and then going to the bathroom, and then I wouldn't see her for 4 hours, and I'd be in her apartment by myself, wondering, what's going on, just watching TV, Mom, wake up. I'm affected by it. I'm still here, and my mom's not. I'm living with actually my mom's family right and left. I don't know my dad. I don't know how I got here, but I surely wasn't planned. My mom was like, what, like you said before, 14, 15, somewhere around there when I was born. So yeah, I think it affects more than one person for sure. It affects everybody who surrounds you and cares about you.
This young boy had been through so much within the first decade of his life, not knowing who his father was, his mother being in and out of his life. Then she was murdered and he was put into foster care. He'd been through it, but his cousin Sonia would say that he handled it very well. And Danny was also said to be very musically inclined. He started piano lessons, guitar lessons, and general music lessons, and that was a great outlet for him. He also loved football and skateboarding. Despite a strong and loving family now raising Daniel, as he entered his adolescence, he began to struggle with alcohol. He'd often be picked up by police and brought home or spend the night in the drunk tank. But Daniel was always said to be very gracious and thankful for all the opportunities and love that his family offered him. As an adult, it seems like Daniel finally got the opportunity to find out who his father was, and he may have also met his father. But his father didn't seem to be a big part of his life whatsoever. But the struggle continued. Just a couple years after graduating high school, Daniel was living in a basement apartment in Squamish when he would suddenly take off on a Greyhound bus, saying that people were after him. It's unclear if he was on drugs at the time or having a mental health issue, or if the statements he was saying were true. But his actions made family believe that he may have been more than just intoxicated by alcohol. Rob would state in an interview with the Vanish podcast that in Daniel's late teens, he did experiment with marijuana, but he also thinks Daniel was using meth due to his paranoia. Rob saying, quote, "It's a robber of dreams when you get involved with those sort of things. And the thing about Danny was, he was so bright. He was above average in intelligence when he was in school. He was a gifted musician. He essentially had everything going for him. And any education post-high school that he wanted to pursue, we were encouraging for him to go and involve himself with. When he was using these substances, that dropped him of all of that. He became paranoid, and it was very sad to see because he was not the Danny that we knew and loved. And it was an on and off thing with him. It wasn't always that way. He wasn't always that person that was on drugs." End quote. Daniel would end up getting kicked off that Greyhound bus in Manitoba, and then was said to proceed to run into the woods, break into a cabin, and would end up in a jail in Winnipeg. After this, he would be picked up by family and taken to Thunder Bay in Ontario. This is where he would spend a few years trying to get his life back on track. But eventually he would return to Squamish, British Columbia. Squamish is a town north of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. It's in the northern tip of the island-dotted Howe Sound and surrounded by mountains like the Chief, a huge granite monolith. After being back in Squamish for some time, Daniel would eventually go on to meet a woman named Keelila, who was also from Squamish Nation, and the two would go on to have a son and daughter. During this time, Daniel was said to be working. He loved his children, and things seemed to be better. He'd often bring his girlfriend and children over to family get-togethers, such as big family dinners or holidays like Christmas.
Why don't you go down the slide, silly Willie? Are you scared? Are you a scaredy cat?
Everyone felt like parenthood was something that was changing Daniel for the better. That he was maturing, he was getting older, and, he was going to shake off all of those old habits and old adolescent traits that he had. Having children seemed to have really recentered him. While living on the reservation with Keelila and their children, Daniel even started playing his guitar again, which, as I said, was a huge passion for him growing up. But Daniel's happy life started to fall apart again. For one reason or another, Daniel and Keelila did not work out, so Daniel began to couch surf, but he always was in constant contact with his family, always calling or messaging them every day or so, and he was also extremely, extremely active on his Facebook. He was always either reposting stuff or just making his own posts on there. At one point, around 2018, Daniel also would end up breaking his hand, to the point that it was going to require surgery, but then he told his family he didn't need it anymore. He'd post photos of his hand on Facebook in May of 2018, saying, quote, "Took a photo while having a splint made, 3 wires and some stitches," end quote. Now, how Daniel broke his hand so badly that it required that type of medical care, well, that once again is something that is kind of unclear. According to what Daniel allegedly told his uncle Rob, he had broken his hand while punching a door. However, in comments made by Keelila, she said, quote, Yes, he did mention that people were after him, and so he went to a recovery center in Surrey. He stated he had to leave town because people were after him. He told me someone smashed his hand with a hammer. He was beat up. He was hanging out with Redacted at the time. He mentioned he was having trouble with people from Vancouver and was sort of in hiding, but he never shared any more details with me. End quote. After this, Daniel once again began appearing untrusting of people. And in one instance, he kicked in the back door of his uncle and aunt's home. But Rob was home at the time, and when he heard the commotion and went down to see what was happening, he says that Daniel seemed very confused that his uncle was there. That day, he had also broken into a neighbor's home that used to be the home of one of his best friends. After this, family once again suspected that Daniel was using again, possibly meth. And once more, Daniel would be arrested. After this, he attempted to message his cousin Sonia to apologize for his actions, but was ignored out of frustration. In an apology post on Facebook on November 6, 2019, Daniel wrote, quote, "Last year I went through some turmoil, and there were a few misunderstandings to say the least. I just want to apologize for a broken window and door from last year whilst I was trying to survive homelessness. I've had hypothermia twice and felt it sinking in." End quote. Despite always being very active on Facebook, on November 23rd of 2019, Daniel would write his last post, saying, quote, "Thinking about my first bit of ink." End quote. After this, Daniel never posted on Facebook again. Then, on the morning of November 25th, 2019, someone from a horse ranch called Kait Ranch on the outskirts of the reservation, north of Squamish, would witness Daniel walking up and down the road in just a t-shirt despite the cold temperatures. They approached him to ask him if he was okay and were provided with a phone number for his uncle Rob, who they called and explained the situation to. Daniel would also be allowed to speak to Rob on the phone at that moment. And I've seen that Daniel both sounded in a good mood, but also like he could be in the midst of a crisis. Daniel allegedly laughed and said he was in a different timeline right now. He told his uncle he loved him, but despite this, his uncle still said he was in good spirits. By 10 a.m. that day, Daniel would be taken into custody by the Squamish RCMP, but police were unable to hold Daniel, so by 5 p.m. that day, he would be released. Around the time he was released, Rob says that he once again spoke to Daniel around 5 p.m., who said that he still sounded in good spirit. By 6 p.m., Daniel would be captured on security video at a Tim Hortons coffee shop. This coffee shop is quite close to the police station. At 6:45 p.m., he was then captured at a Walmart that was also nearby. He'd again be seen at a Tim Hortons after 7 p.m. After this, he'd get a ride to the reservation. It's unknown what Daniel did for the next few hours or who gave him a ride. Daniel would last be seen later that night around 1 a.m., which was now November 26th, in a nearby area of the reservation near Kait Ranch, but this time on the rear deck of his Aunt Katrina's property, in the 6500 block of Squamish Valley Road. Note that this was not the uncle and aunt that raised him. This area of the reservation is said to be beautiful land, but sparsely populated, with a rushing river nearby. Now, I've seen alleged that before going to his aunt's property, Daniel was in a fight with an unknown friend near the river, and that's how he then ended up at his Aunt Katrina's home. He also apparently had belongings at this home, and his vehicle was nearby. Katrina allegedly said that that night, Daniel was acting strangely, as those earlier that day recounted. He was apparently calling his Aunt Katrina's dog by the wrong name, and he was saying that he was getting married. He once again wasn't dressed appropriately for the weather, so Katrina's husband told him to put a jacket on. But instead, after this, Daniel would run off the porch down a trail that led to Lewis Drive. As you can see, there isn't much around that area besides a few homes, a river, and the vast amount of wilderness. That would be the last time Daniel would ever be seen again. Now, as I mentioned, Daniel had a car, so despite all of these sightings of him wandering on foot throughout the area, he had a vehicle, so why wasn't he using it? Daniel's car is described as a black 2004 Honda Civic with license plate JL933R, which was said to be located and seized around 2:20 p.m. later that day on November 26th. Rob would say on the Vanish podcast that Daniel's vehicle had been on the road and a tow had been requested for it. It's also said that Daniel's phone was left inside of his car, meaning no one could trace him. But there's multiple different stories out there as to where Daniel's vehicle last was, why it was towed. It's a bit of a mess. What we do know, though, is that as the beginning of December began, Daniel's family began to notice that he wasn't contacting anyone. And what really began to make people notice was when his grandfather passed away, and Rob would end up having to fly back to Ontario to attend the funeral. His grandmother, who he was very close with, had actually just died a few months prior to this as well. So when his grandfather passed away, his family attempted to contact him to let him know the news. However, no one could figure out where he was, and he wasn't answering anyone's messages. So Rob and Sonia began to call around to family in Squamish Nation, trying to see if anyone knew where he was. But no one did. Even Keelela didn't know where he was. Her and the children hadn't seen him either. At the time of Daniel's disappearance, he actually had a probation officer. However, just before Christmas, when Rob would call his probation officer to see if Daniel had ever checked in with him, because he was supposed to do, check-ins every so often, the probation officer wouldn't provide him with any information. Rob then called the main office in Squamish Nation, and he was told that someone thought they had seen Daniel picking up a check there. Now, the sighting ended up being unsubstantiated, and in the end, it was determined that Daniel had never picked that check up. It was still there. Christmas would then come and go with no word from Daniel. You'd think if he was out there and capable, he would have at least called his children to say Merry Christmas to them. But he didn't. So at 4:15 p.m. on January 7th of 2020, Rob would call the Squamish RCMP and report Daniel missing, citing he was unreachable and had not been seen before Christmas. After police would conduct several welfare checks and were also unable to locate him, Daniel would officially be classified as missing. It would also finally be revealed that he had not checked in with his probation officer. And due to the police interactions with Daniel on November 25th, Squamish RCMP would contact the Independent Investigations Office of BC to ensure a transparent investigation. Due to Daniel's Indigenous heritage, Squamish RCMP is said to have worked with Squamish Nation, the Integrated First Nations Unit, the BC Police Missing Persons Center, and Squamish Search and Rescue in trying to determine his whereabouts. Police in Squamish Search and Rescue have conducted searches in the Squamish Valley and Paradise Valley areas. Searches have been done by boat, foot, and air, looking for any signs of Daniel or information that would provide answers to the family, yet none have been found. In the aftermath of Daniel not being found, some began to wonder if it wasn't drugs that were affecting Daniel, but instead mental health issues. After we covered the case of Christopher Newton, who was a schizophrenic man who went missing in the nearby city of Nelson, it makes me wonder as well, especially with all of this mentioning of Daniel saying people were following him or coming for him. In Daniel's case, there was reports of him having what seems like paranoia, doing strange things that don't make sense to anyone else, saying that he's on a different timeline and that people are after him. Issues like this also manifest in men between the ages of 15 to 25 years old sometimes. And that's around the time frame where, Daniel started acting differently. And as we spoke about in Christopher's case, these mental health issues could also lead to drug use to try to quiet those voices. So it could even be a mix. So I can understand why this has been considered as a theory as well. Another theory that's been brought up is that Daniel possibly drowned in that river that was nearby his aunt's home, whether by accident or by choice. If he had gone into that river and wasn't searched for right away, it's a possibility he may never be found. No one was looking for him until over a month after he disappeared. He could have been washed hundreds of kilometers away, and if that was so, his body could be somewhere in a very remote part of where this river is, or it could have been washed towards the ocean because this river does connect to the ocean. The river has, though, been searched by both authority and the family, but nothing was ever found. Those closest to him have said that they felt like the RCMP was leaning towards Daniel unaliving himself, which seems to be a theory in a lot of cases. Unfortunately, when Daniel went missing, it was the winter time, so that hampered a lot of search efforts, and then on top of that, COVID happened just a couple months later, which locked everything down and again really took away the eyes and efforts from his disappearance. The Odd Squad, which is the group of police officers that did the Through the Blue Lens documentary and worked closely with Daniel's mother, would also join in on spreading the word and searching for Daniel. They were a big part of him and his mother's life. It's also been dismissed that Daniel would have simply walked off to start a new life. His bank accounts have never been touched. He left all of his belongings behind, as well as his vehicle and his phone. It's as if after he walked off that porch, he simply vanished. But what we really need to talk about is the strange and very prominent connection to another case we've spoken about, the disappearance of Marshal Iwaasa. I've covered Marshall's case before, so I recommend going and watching that video so you can get a full overlook on his case and a full understanding of it. That's another very, very mysterious one. But as a refresher, Marshall was from Lethbridge, Alberta, but after a strange night of actions, his vehicle will be found set on fire 1,100 kilometers away on a remote logging road that leads towards the Brian Waddington Hut near Pemberton, British Columbia. Marshall was last seen on November 17, 2019 by his mother, and his vehicle would later be found in that state on November 23rd. Daniel would disappear just 3 days later on November 26th, only an hour away from where the vehicle was found. So why, years later, are these two cases now saying to be connected? Well, a man named Markham Marlowe claims to have seen both Daniel and Marshall at the same time at a bar called That Irish Place, which is now called Tandoori Flame Sports Bar, located at 40330 Tantalus Road in Squamish. Michael claims this took place a couple days after Marshall's disappearance, but before Daniel's disappearance, approximately 3 weeks into November 2019, which would mean it happened sometime between November 17th to November 25th, since Daniel disappeared in the early hours of November 26th. He also claims a third unidentified man was with them that night. Another man named Daniel Scott also recalls Daniel saying to him that he came from That Irish Place. Now, the biggest claim to connection between these two cases is regarding the mystery cooler that was found at the site of Marshall's burned out vehicle. This cooler garnished a lot of questions back when Marshall went missing and his vehicle was found. However, there are now claims that that cooler is in fact Daniel's. In a deep dive posted on the Daniel Reoch missing Facebook page, an individual named Liam stated that, quote, Daniel's family has confirmed that the cooler found was Daniel's and in Daniel's possession. The name found on it was Daniel's friend, who they did drugs together. It needs to be noted that the 2 trash bags that were found with clothes were Daniel's, that he kept in his car. That's also been confirmed by family, end quote. So, as we see, the name on the cooler is Cody Lewis. And again, I've seen 2 different versions of events regarding this, that Cody Lewis is either Daniel's friend or his cousin. But as we can see, Daniel is friends on Facebook with a Cody Lewis. And if this is true, if this cooler truly is Daniel's, why was it found at the site of Marshall's burned out vehicle? And why are there people claiming that they seen Marshall and Daniel together days after Marshall disappeared from Alberta and around the time his vehicle was found destroyed? And then why did Daniel disappear right after that? Now, despite this information being out there, it's unclear if police are looking into this. There's a lot of talk of the possibilities of how this connection works, if Daniel is involved with Marshall's disappearance, or he knows the people that are involved with Marshall's disappearance that may have led to his own disappearance. But there's so many unknowns, it's hard to say. We do have to consider that there is a possibility that Daniel wasn't experiencing a mental health crisis, and it could have been drugs, and that he could have gotten himself into something very dark and very scary, and that he may have been telling the truth when he was telling people that people were after him. I've also seen connections that both Daniel and Marshall worked in the same field of work, and they may have worked with the same company. There's people that have really spent years diving into these 2 cases and trying to dissect the connections. And hats off to them, because they did a lot of research. What I do know is, if that truly is Daniel's cooler that was at the site of the car, and those are his belongings that are there, it's definitely strange, and it makes me wonder why. Why were his belongings left there? And did Daniel know too much, and is that why he went missing? And if we're going down that route, we also have to remember he somehow injured his hand, or had his hand injured in some way. And according to the mother of his children, he told her that someone broke it with a hammer. Is that just mental health psychosis, telling people strange stories? And he really did just injure it himself, but could you really injure your hand that badly just simply punching a door, that it would require the type of medical care that it needed? To me, the images of his hand look like something much worse than just punching a door. But I'm not a medical professional, but let me know how you feel about that. But if his hand really then was broken by someone using a hammer on it, what was he involved in? That sounds like something that could go as far as possibly turning into a disappearance. That sounds extremely terrifying. All we do know is that Daniel walked off that porch and was never seen again. And then we also have Marshall, who also drove across the country allegedly and vanished. If it truly was him driving his vehicle, because again, We don't have any video footage to prove that it really was Marshall driving his vehicle through the country. Multiple vigils have been held over the years for Daniel. In 2023, his children were 9 and 7 years old, and they attended with their mother. Keely saying, quote, "I know my kids right now are kind of feeling it. We've been talking about him. I just wanted to be able to put more of him out there so that people can start talking and hopefully maybe something can come of it. Just to refresh everybody, we miss him. The kids miss him a lot. They still remember him. We want to be able to get answers for the kids." End quote. When it comes to Daniel's disappearance, there are still a lot of questions as to why no one raised an alarm in such a small community when he wasn't heard from or seen from for a long period of time, especially someone who seemed to be so active on social media and who was always in contact with at least someone. How could he leave his belongings at someone's home and his vehicle, but yet no one raised an alarm when he didn't come back for them? Could it just be that everyone was assuming he was at someone else's home or speaking with someone else because he was couch hopping, it seems like, quite frequently? I think that's definitely possible. Just kind of like a bystander effect of sorts, where everyone else thinks it's someone else's problem, that someone else must know where he is. And I say that because after the alarms were raised, everyone jumped in to searching for Daniel. So what do you think may have happened here? Do you think that it might all just be an accident, that after walking off his aunt's porch into the forest, he may have accidentally fell into the river and drowned? Do you think there's something larger at play here that might tie Marshall and Daniel together? Or could Daniel's disappearance be completely unrelated, but still foul play? Let's take one more good look at Daniel. Daniel is described as an indigenous male standing 5 foot 9 inches tall and weighing around 150 pounds. He has brown hair and brown eyes. Daniel was last seen wearing a blue, brown, and tan plaid button-up long-sleeve shirt, a blue, black, and beige button-up long-sleeve shirt, dark-colored suspenders, black baggy pants, and black shoes with white trim around the soles, with a black shoelace on the right foot and a white shoelace on the left foot. What I do know is Daniel's children and family deserve answers. He's missed watching his children grow up, and they've missed making memories with their dad. So if you know anything, please say something. Please give this family closure. I'll have the contact information for the authorities below. And if you have any other information that we didn't chat about here today, let's have a conversation down in the comment section. I'll be down there discussing this case with you all. My heart goes out to Daniel's family. I truly hope they get answers soon. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there. Lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.